keep us safe. My name is Carmen Perez-Jordan, and I am the president and CEO of the Gathering for Justice. I'm calling in from Lenape land, which is known as Manhattan. Before we begin tonight's program, I'd like to take a moment to extend our deepest condolences and send our love to our brother and dear friend, my son Lennon, whose mother passed away yesterday. Our prayers go out to my son, his brothers, sister, his sons, and his grandson, and to everyone who loved and cherished Patricia Lennon. For those of you who don't know, the Gathering for Justice was founded by legendary Harry Belafonte in 2005, after he saw a story on the news about a 5-year-old Black girl in Florida being handcuffed for throwing a tantrum. Immediately, Mr. Belafonte brought together movement elders and youth from all across the United States, including me, to form a covenant to end child incarceration and dismantle systemic racism in our criminal justice system. The Gathering is now in our 17th year of movement work. Much of what we do takes place at the intersections of racial justice and social justice. And the We Keep Us Safe series was specifically developed to be a platform for our community to share ideas and collaborate on some of the most pressing issues our community faces. Tonight's program was inspired by New York Governor Kathy Hochul's State of Address last month and the new mayor's many statements about crime and public safety. We want tonight's program to give leaders in the areas of education, policing, public safety, criminal justice, and voting rights an opportunity to address the state of our people and the state of our union. But before we introduce our first panelist, I am very excited to welcome my co-moderator for the evening, my dear brother, the great journalist and activist, Reverend Mark Thompson. Many of you know Mark Thompson as one of the most important voices in journalism today, with a deep connection to Black history and Black liberation. His bio and his accolades are really too many to mention, so I'm just gonna pull some highlights for all of you tonight. He's worked with Reverend Jesse Jackson's 1984 presidential campaign. He began his long career in journalism in 1988 under the guidance of the great Kathy Hughes. He co-hosted a radio show with the legendary Dick Gregory. He's been honored by everyone, including the NAACP, and received the United Nations Human Rights Award. He's gone to jail many, many, many times fighting for voting rights, DC statehood, and more. As a college freshman at Georgetown University in 1985, he organized the building of a shanty town on campus, which led to the university's divestment from South Africa and apartheid. In 1996, he was responsible, along with Maxine Waters and others, for exposing the CIA's role in the crack epidemic. And he cheers for the Yankees. Welcome, Mark. I'm so happy to have you here with us tonight.
I'm honored to be here and great to be back with you, Queen. Much love to you and the family.
Oh, I'm so excited. Brother, you've had such an extraordinary life and really have been at the seat of power at many critical times in the country's history and in Black history. As we sit here today during Black History Month, and we're about to talk to some of our siblings, brothers, and sisters in the movement about the state of our people, I'd like to hear your thoughts about where we are.
Well, Carmen, we are not in an ideal place. We are taking it on the chin in a lot of respects. And I know we're going to be talking about some of these topics even tonight. We're taking it on the chin in terms of education. There's a battle now as to whether or not diverse histories of the diverse cultures in this country should be taught. Lord knows what we're dealing with in terms of policing. There has been no ebb in terms of police violence toward people of color. Criminal justice reform has slowed. And then one of the most important of all that's on the tips of everyone's tongue is voting rights. and the erosion of those voting rights. Right now, I'm talking to you from Selma, Alabama. I've come down here for a couple of meetings early to get ready for the annual Bridge Crossing Jubilee, and to think we're still fighting the fight that was fought in 1965 on the March from Selma to Montgomery. And those issues are not only not resolved, but we're going in reverse. So we've got to beef up our morale. We've got to get more organized, and we've got to be prepared to continue this fight. We really can't rest. The last thing I'll say, as quickly as I can, Carmen, one of the things I'm most proud of, and I appreciate you sharing too much of my experience, the one thing I'm most proud of is standing with you all at the Women's March. And I remind people, for those of us who might get weary, 1973 was when the Supreme Court decided Roe. The enemies of Roe and the enemies of women's reproductive choice, though, did not stop. They didn't reverse Roe in 74, 75, 76, 77, but they kept organizing until now, 49 years later, going on 50 years later, Roe might actually be reversed, which would be tragic. The point is, our enemies don't give up, neither can we.
I love that. Thank you so much, Mark. Well, I'm going to give it to you so that you can introduce our first segment. And I'm so happy to be in this conversation and moderation with you.
Well, speaking of education, as I said earlier, we're going to start with education. And let me just also say I'm grateful to the Gathering and the Justice League for inviting me and including me in so many of the activities and events that you all have. Makes me feel like I'm still relevant. Our first segment, of course, is about education. A tremendous leaders with us in the field of education, a great organizer, a singer, one thing that was left off too, a fashionista. She is the advocacy director of the New York State Alliance for Quality Education, the leading statewide organization that has been fighting for educational justice in New York State. She's the mother of 8, the grandparent of 4. She's dedicated 20 years of her life to the fight for educational justice and ending the oppression of Black and brown people. She was named one of City and State Magazine's 25 most influential people in Brooklyn. She's a member, of course, of the Justice League NYC and the Resistance Revival Chorus. That's the singing. She's a 2020 Atlantic Fellow for Racial Equality, and she has an Instagram, 2 Instagrams, one for her and then the other one that's high fashion. Okay, so Queen Sister Zakiyah Ansari joins us tonight. Hey.
Thank you, Mark. I learned so much about you today, man. I just know you as just this fabulous person. The history is like, I can't wait to pick your brain at another time, but wow.
Well, bless your heart. Thank you. Well, Carmen, I'm happy to talk to you. And I'm gonna just tell y'all right now, I moved to New York 11 years ago, and Zakiyah was one of the first people I met. One of the first things she said to me was wanting to talk about education. And I think in about 5 minutes, Carmen, she gave me the whole rundown on the state of education in New York. And I was like, whoa, I mean, it was serious. And so let's just start there. What are you involved in right now? What is going on in terms of education? And also tell us about the New York State Universal Child Care Act.
Yeah, so let me start off. The thing that I was talking to you about, there's no doubt, hey everyone, was around the Campaign for Physical Equity, because our organization, the Alliance for Quality Education, that was how we were created 21 years ago. And I'm proud to announce that last year, in the midst of a global pandemic, in the midst of a racial reckoning of folks taken to the streets, Cuomo under, doing his dirty, we were able to actually bring that almost 30-year battle home. So last year during the state budget, because of the organizing of parents and community members for the last 20 plus years, we were able to bring home $4 billion over the next 3 years for Black, brown, and poor children. So it'll be a 3-year phase-in. We are in year 2. And what we're hearing from this Governor Hochul, is that we don't have to worry for year 2, those dollars are there. And so while we are, until it's in there and schools actually have it, we are still advocating for it, but we haven't had to go as hard as we had for the last 20 years to actually get the state to fully fulfill its commitment to funding that. So we're super excited about that. And again, I want to just say, it is a collective victory for folks, for parents, students, educators, and community members across New York State. So that's one. And that was a huge victory, a historic victory. And so next year we'll be celebrating that last phase in, but the work continues, right? And so as part of that work that continues at the Alliance for Quality Education is childcare as well. And so the Universal Child Care Act. So let me just tell you something really exciting. From September to December, we were collaborating with Senator Jabari Brisport and Assembly Member Andrew Hevesy. They are both co-chairs of the Committee on Child Care and the state legislature. And they really committed themselves. 10 weeks, they did all 5 boroughs, and they did parts of upstate New York. And they went to talk to providers, child care providers, not only in centers, but home care, all across in every borough, multiple times, every Wednesday for 10 weeks. And after those tours that they had on Wednesday, usually in the day, that evening, they would have a town hall conversation where they invited other state elected officials to participate, especially if they were in that particular district. So Queens or wherever they were, they invited them to participate. And so we had folks from all over. Assemblymember Hasty came to one in the Bronx. Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins came to one in Westchester. And Governor Hochul actually came to one and said, you know what? When I was younger, when I had my kids and I was raising them, childcare was important to me. The reality is, though, which is why we have to hold elected officials accountable, is that talk is cheap. And in her executive budget this year, while she still said she cared about childcare, the dollars needed to actually fund it were not there, right? And so we say, once again, talk is cheap. And if you really care about it, then we got to put dollars behind it. And our demand is for a $5 billion investment in universal childcare. Why? So it's extremely important. It's not just about making sure that anybody who needs childcare can afford it, not just so they can go back to work. How about so they can have a mental break, right? Parents need time to chill for themselves and not, even if they don't want to go to work. The wealthy do it all the time, right? Anybody who raises kids knows that it's a stressful time. So one for that, but also the very folks who take care of our most precious jewels, our babies, from 0 to 12, because childcare dollars pays for after school as well, up to 12 years old. Those folks are making less than minimum wage. I went on some of these tours and some of the providers were like, my mom works for me. Her mom was in her late 60s and I can't afford for my mother to retire and she doesn't have a pension. That is unacceptable. The work that they are doing is way beyond anything we can imagine, and they deserve to have a fair pay wage that is connected to the absolute amazing work that they're doing with young people. So childcare is extremely important, and I'm encouraging folks, anybody who's in New York State who cares about childcare, even if you don't have kids in the system or you don't have children right now, if you care about children, then call Governor Hochul and say invest $5 billion in childcare. Always got to be an ask. Sorry, Mom. Gotta get the,
I have to, in there. as a parent who is paying close to $4,000 for my child to go to school, he's a three-year-old, and I'm paying about $600 a week for my 1-year-old. I mean, I'm having to work a full-time second job in order just to keep my kids entertained, right? Somebody needs to look after them, especially those of us who don't have family here. And so I believe, what you're saying is so important. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand that. You're trying to pay the people that are watching your children a living wage, but you're also unable to provide a lot of things that you need for yourself. And so in a pandemic, it's extremely hard. There are so many parents that have lost their jobs, and there's just a need at this moment. And I know you and I at some point need to have a conversation to a broader community about why it's important to pass New York State Universal Child Care Act. But I want to transition into critical race theory. And I say that because, as a person of color who learned about her history in college and maybe through oral stories of my father and you know, sitting at the feet of Mr. Belafonte, I've learned a lot about this country and what this country has done to particularly Chicanos, Mexicans, and African Americans, and Puerto Ricans, right? And indigenous people. So let's also name that. But, you know, Derek Bell was an attorney who kind of came up with this concept. And I recently learned about a woman named Dr. Bernal Delgado, who wrote about Latino race theory. And why do you think it's important for our schools to teach that? Why is it important for us to know about our culture? And what are some of the negative implications that we have seen or you have seen just around that idea of teaching it in the classroom?
Yeah, we all deserve an accurate, honest, and high quality public education, right? Honest, accurate. And it's important that it just makes sense. It's almost like the fact that we have to argue why is it important to have an accurate history is really concerning. You know, if folks, these right-wing folks and others who are pushing this false narrative and misinformation, if it was up to them in a few years, that insurrection will not be in any books, right? That's what that really is, around pushing real history that's impactful, that needs to be told so we don't repeat the same history, which is why we're going down this road right now, because we've chosen not to actually teach accurate history in our public schools, period, right? That's why the Coalition for Educational Justice here in New York City, Black, brown immigrant parents have been pushing for the last few years to actually have a culturally responsive and sustained education and curriculum. And so we might have that coming up soon with the Mosaic curriculum. And we know that certain politicians are like using a character of critical race theory to rob us from our history and the knowledge to solve our biggest challenges. And we got to say no to that, right? But we have to unpack that in a really brave and courageous way, because systemic racism is baked into our society, period, full stop. And in our laws and in our institutions, right? And individuals are not solely responsible for systemic racism. And we know that. It can persist with or without individual people having racist attitudes. And so what we're finding is that folks are actually, there's states, dozens of states across this country who have already passed laws to ban books, as many of you have heard, like Ruby Bridges, Malcolm X is not being taught, like anything that impacts LGBTQIA students, anything that talks about really unpacking indigenous communities and what the white communities have done and colonization has done in those communities, is anything that makes, literally in Florida, passed the law saying that if it makes, pretty much, I'm paraphrasing, white people feel uncomfortable, then you cannot teach that. Well, you know what is, I heard Dr. Brittany Cooper say this, you know what's more uncomfortable? Slavery, right? You know what's more uncomfortable? Like taking away our right to vote. Like those are the things. So if people can feel uncomfortable for a minute, and we've been, you know, literally those people feeling uncomfortable has harmed us, killed us, maimed us, and left us many times in education systems that don't look at us and see us in our full humanity, then be uncomfortable. Because guess what? Even in that history, there were white folks who stood up and side by side, from the civil rights movement to all the way back, to stand side by side with us and say, this is unacceptable, right? And if we are addressing this, you know, really harmful narrative, right? Whether we're white, Black, brown, or Asian, it's important for us to know our history. And this is bigger than just the education. It is another attack on public education as a whole. Privatizers and others have been trying to get public education. It's almost the last public institution left in our nation. So what better way to take advantage of this moment? It is absolutely about attacking LGBTQIA rights, not just in schools, but across the board, period. It is absolutely about attacking our voting rights. So it is about attacking and dismantling our democracy as a whole. And that's not an overestimation. That is the reality, and that is the facts. And so we can't act like we don't see this. We have to address this. Not, and I just want to say this and I'll stop, not from the critical race theory, but from the things that people have been fighting for. Young people have been fighting to get police-free schools and get police out of schools. right? This is part of that narrative, right? They want us to not want to do that either. We have been fighting for culturally responsive education, restorative justice practices in schools, right? All these things are under attack, and that's how we want to fight it. We want to fight it by leaning in to the things that we want and not cater to their narrative as they have us go chasing something else. So we need to really lay down the law and say, we're not going to bow down to this. Honest history is important. We stake our democracy on that. And if we let them get away with this, as we saw in elections like Virginia and Youngkin, who has a whole bounty out on people and has a hotline telling folks to call in if you find any teachers teaching about critical race theory. What the heck? How is somebody going to do that? There's laws that say we're going to have cameras in classrooms now so we can watch a teacher teach and see if they're teaching critical race theory. This has nothing to do about critical race theory. It really does not. It has to do with really dismantling public education. And the quicker we know that and push back, the better we are as a nation. And the reality is the better we are at holding on to our democracy.
And just on that, one more point on critical race theory, when it comes to New York, where you do most of your organizing, is what things like what we see in Virginia, are they happening to any extent here in New York? Are people Absolutely. Trying to prevent certain books and certain history? First of all, I want everybody to be clear, as Zakiyah alluded to, critical race theory is a graduate level course in law school. It was never taught at the elementary and secondary school system. So that's a myth in of itself. But New York, which is supposed to be a somewhat more liberal state, is not Virginia. But is that people still acting like a fool here?
Absolutely. There's this organization, many of you might have heard, Moms of Liberty. You already know. You hear that. You don't even got to know what they do. You just hear the name and you're like, They are literally, I hear they're in New York as well, New York State, in different parts. They're actually in 160 cities or something like that across the country. They actually are offering $500 bounties for anybody. You don't even have to live in the state where you're reporting that your teachers are teaching critical race theory. They're giving $500. So one, we need to follow the money, because where you getting all that money from? So that's one. Yes, and that's how I live in Long Island now, and we saw critical race theory come up in some of the narratives that got a lot of Republicans voted in here in Long Island as well. But even as I talked about the Coalition for Educational Justice, they have a culturally responsive and sustaining education piece around curriculum. And now DOE last year, done under de Blasio, invested $500 million with an M into creating a mosaic curriculum, which is centered on culturally responsive and sustained education, which hasn't been developed yet. And CEJ is really fighting to make sure that parents are part of that process and what that looks like. So even, having conversations with the current chancellor and making sure they're in there, right? But even that, we're finding on community education councils here in New York City, that there are people who got elected that are saying things like, we want human education. Yeah, you define that. There you go. Like, we need to focus on quality, not racism. Right? So those are the dog whistles that we are hearing here. We all know what they lead to. Like if you're do this work, and you didn't have to do this work, if you're Black and brown, Indigenous, and you've heard that language and lingo before, you already know what it means. So yes, it's here. It's also upstate New York. We're hearing about it. School board elections, people, that's the other thing they're going for. Many of them are running across the country on school board elections. So if you're interested in running for a school board and you care about equity, challenge some folks, because we have to get out there and really tell the alternate story. Because if you were watching the news, you would think that the only people who are fighting, the only thing you see that people are fighting against critical race theory. There is a movement that I am part of on a national level that the African American Policy Forum is part of, Kimberly Crenshaw, and organizing, that Black Lives Matter at School is part of, Race Forward, like Metro Center here in New York. We're part of really organizing how do we protect our history to teach the truth. There's a Teach Truth campaign. There's an education project. So if you've heard this and you're like, yo, we're going downhill and it's going down fast, trust and believe. We are fighting back in a real way. Unfortunately, we don't have the media, Fox 5 churning out lies, the Post churning out lies, and other folks like that. So the fight is happening. Stay inspired, stay involved, and stay alert.
I just want to kind of end us in this section with a quote from Mr. Belafonte: "The roots of our past become the seeds of our future." And that's really important to consistently teach our young people about self, because that's really the way in which we build a community. I know we got a couple of minutes with you, Zakiyah. Just want to talk a little bit about safety officers, police-free schools, campaigns. What are we working on?
Yeah, so Dignity in Schools here in New York, which is mostly led by young people, really are pushing forward to end police in schools. I'm really concerned, like we all are, and I'm sure you're going to talk about it later. The Justice League has really been pushing out this facts, not fear agenda, and I think it's right on. We know fear is stoking as well as conflation of police, period, and police in schools, right? And we unfortunately always center the adults and not the children. So we tell the most egregious stories of why we need police in schools, but when young people tell the most egregious stories of the impact and harm that police have done to them in schools, it's dismissed. And we can no longer do that. If we're not centering young people's stories in this, we do a disservice, right? And we need to redefine safety, because there's not a lot of young people that I know of that will tell you that they feel safe seeing someone, the same people in the same uniforms, whether you want to call them police or not. That's a whole nother narrative, longer conversation we need to have. The same people that don't speak to them and greet them in their neighborhoods, they get to this class, the door of their school where they're supposed to learn. They go through metal detectors, really hostile environments, and then they're supposed to sit down in front of a classroom and a teacher in that moment and be happy and excited to be in the classroom. So there's an agenda to, yes, reduce and get police out of schools. There's conversations that need to happen, real conversations, but they're not centered in equity. And until if we have more police officers in our schools than all of Las Vegas, that is unacceptable. Right. And then there's some schools that don't even have a social worker, a school counselor, or a school nurse. So our priorities, if a budget is a moral document and we spend $450 million to put police in schools, but there's schools that don't have a social worker, I don't have to say anymore. We are not taking care and caring for kids, especially after 2 years in a pandemic. Shame on us.
I think your signal broke up. It sounded like you said there are police and these officers in schools, but there are no social workers and nurses. Sound like that's what you said. That's not what you said.
Or counselors.
Or counselors. That's not what you said, right?
Nurses, yeah. Or there's a social worker for every 400, 800 kids. That's not equity. That's not centering young people.
That's not a learning environment. That sounds like a prison.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure you'll talk more about that too.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Zakiyah, for being with us. I'm going to pass it over to you, Mark, to introduce the next segment.
Thank you, Zakiyah. All right, hat and scarf. All right, we're going to transition, which is a good segue, hearing about what's happening in the schools, to the issue of policing and public safety. Carmen is going to be an expert panelist in this segment, and so she'll be joining in terms of answering some of the questions. First up, please welcome Julie Ciccolini. Julie directs the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers Full Disclosure Project, which supports partners across the nation with implementing and managing databases to track law enforcement misconduct and challenge police secrecy laws. In her previous role at the Legal Aid Society, Julie developed a web application to track police misconduct that NACDL now implements in other offices. She also designed and managed the Cop Accountability Project database used by 12 organizations across New York City to investigate NYPD misconduct. Most recently, Julie was a research technologist at Human Rights Watch, where using a range of technical skills, she supported remote and digital investigations in human rights abuses. We also have with us I think I saw her come in. Linda Sarsour is here as well. Assalamu alaikum. Of course, the author of the tremendous book, We Are Not Here to Be Bystanders, a memoir of love and resistance. She's the founder of Empower Change, former executive director of the Arab American Association of New York, an unapologetic Palestinian Muslim woman from Brooklyn, and the co-founder of Until Freedom. Last but not least at all, we're honored to have Nick E. Smith. He's the first deputy public advocate for the city of New York. In this role, Nick is responsible for representing public advocate Jumaane D. Williams and leading the policy, legislative, communications, and community engagement divisions of the office. Previously, Nick served as a legislative representative to the mayor of the city of New York. In this role, he negotiated more than 200 pieces of public safety and housing legislation and advised the heads of city agencies. For example, he was lead negotiator for a law that made all calls from incarcerated persons on Rikers Island made all those calls free. He's had a series of additional roles in and out of government, including Deputy Chief of Staff for Jumaane Williams during his council tenure, where he co-founded the National Network to Combat Gun Violence. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. Welcome to each and every one of you. All right now, so our new mayor looks like he's trying to have a little deja vu when it comes to policing, right? Who wants to go first to take that on and give us an update on that?
We could start a little slow and start it with Nick and do the diplomatic answer to that one, and then we could go on another route.
Okay.
I'm gonna give you a way out of this one, Nick. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think you just saved me. Thank you. Thank you all for having the panel, and kudos to the gathering and all of you. I love how Linda framed this, and I'll say it this way: in terms of state of the people and where Black folks and people of color are in policing, we're not where we need to be. That's very obvious. And I think what we're seeing, not just in the city of New York, but really in the country, moves to turn back the clock from an era where we were really locking up folks with impunity for things like petty quality of life crimes. I think most folks on this panel are very familiar that our president passed a crime bill in the 90s, and I must add, supported by some folks from our communities, that did lead to our mass incarceration. 3 strikes law, part of them. I'm originally from California. I really saw how folks were locked up based on these 3 strikes. I remember one story, there was a brother who allegedly stole a piece of candy from a store, and he went to prison for life, 3rd strike. And so I think in this era, we're seeing a lot of fear and fear mongering by those who want to turn the clock back, and we have to resist that. And we elected a mayor, and I got to be clear, that election was basically a 3-way tie. We had the 3 candidates who ran in a primary of ranked choice, and the vote split was very close. So I wouldn't call this sort of so-called mandate to turn back the clock a real mandate. I think we've got to, those of us who are reformers, have got to continue to resist and be loud, because if not, we may go backwards. And so I'll give one quick example, then pass the mic to my colleagues. When the now mayor of the city of New York ran, he basically said, we're going to bring back the plainclothes unit in NYPD. Let's pause for a second and think plainclothes unit. These are detectives and officers who are in plain clothes, who often run up and engage in aggressive and over-aggressive policing. And you may have no idea who the hell they are. Well, if someone runs up on me and I don't know who they are and I see no identifiable uniform, I may have a certain reaction. And so that same unit was behind involved in the deaths of people that I'm sad to announce. Eric Garner, Sean Bell, Saheed Vassell, and many other New Yorkers. 30% of the fatal shootings in this city, I think it was 3 years ago, involved this unit. And so the mayor is saying, oh, well, we're going to change the car and change the uniform. But are we changing the policing? These units were over policing Harlem, where I live, and other Black and brown neighborhoods. And so I'll wrap by saying this for this question. We've got to remain consistent, persistent, and loud, because we can't allow those who have a worldview that police are the solution to the social problems. We can't let that become crystallized, because we're seeing some unfortunate incidents, including shootings of officers. So we got to keep moving forward, and we're committed to doing it. Thank you, Rev.
That was diplomatic. That's what's supposed to be. Okay. That's cool.
That was the most diplomatic that you're gonna get, but Nick still works for Jumaane, so you know he was gonna keep it kind of real, you know what I'm saying?
Okay,
I know there's certain things. I mean, I appreciate Nick, and I gave him that platform because I'm very proud to have a public advocate in a public advocate's office who is not, kind of succumbing to the fear mongering that we're hearing right now from the media, from the right wing, and unfortunately from our mayor, who is a very brilliant communicator. You got to give the guy some credit. I mean, he is inspirational. He goes into a room, he watches with the audience. He just knows how to orate, and he knows how to get a crowd going. I mean, you and I, Rev, were in a room with him just the other day and kind of was able to experience that firsthand. I think what's happening right now in New York City is that we're creating this dichotomy and this false choice for our communities. And the mayor has been very, unfortunately, one of the people that has fed this narrative. It's us against the killers, right? It's us against the gangbangers. It's us against the shooters. And that is a very dangerous narrative for us. And we know that people in our community are afraid, and that we do see gun violence in our communities. People are dying. And we are also a movement, as you know, that is founded on the sanctity of Black life. So we also are a movement that does not want to see police officers murdered either. So we understand that the political climate has to be put into context. But that does not mean that we give up policies and give up proposals that criminal justice reform activists have been working on for over 2 decades. We are not going to go and succumb to the fear mongering of the New York Post and the ways in which they're treating Alvin Bragg. Alvin Bragg is putting forth policies that we've seen other DAs do, like my friend Eric Gonzalez in Brooklyn. But for some reason, a Black DA comes to Manhattan and he's in every headline 16,000 times a day on policies that are actually not even as progressive as the criminal justice reform movement wants them to be. And one of the things, the mayor told the story about, a mother who, when her son was 11 years old, she tried to call the city. This is a old story. And he tells the story about this mother who was calling city agencies saying, listen, my child needs help. He's going down the wrong path. I don't know what to do. I need support. I need services. And the mayor, our current mayor, says nobody picked up her calls in the city. The woman didn't get the support that she needed for her child. So when he became 18 years old, not only was he already on trial for murder, but then he himself gets murdered. And so his point was that if we get these services to the community, if we're able to interject before these shootings happen, if we're able to help build the quality of life of Black and brown communities in New York City, if we invest in programs, in jobs, in mental health services, maybe that's the way that we are able to address gun violence. My concern with the narrative is when the cops come, the shooting already happened. When the cop comes, the violent assault already happened. The car theft already happened. So policing is not a prevention tool, right? Policing is supposed to be, you come when the emergency already happened. And so this idea that police are what makes us safe, that police are the deterrent to violent crime can't be true, because as we see in New York City, that absolutely is not what we're seeing on the streets of our community. So I hope that as we have this conversation, we continue to have this conversation, that progressives and those who believe in a criminal justice system that works for all, that we're not going to back down on our policy priorities because we know they are the solution. There is data to back up what we have been advocating for, and that we are not succumbing to the New York Post and the right wing and Republicans and more conservative Democrats who don't care how many Black and brown people go to prison. And at the same time, balance empathy, because I'm not going to lie to you, when I watched that funeral of 22-year-old Officer Rivera, I'm not going to lie to you. I saw his photo and I said, this baby, 22 years old, like, he didn't deserve to die. And I don't think anyone in our community just would ever celebrate the death of police officers. But we also can't exploit this tragic event that should never have happened to then say all these policies are bad and we're going to roll back all the progress that we have been working on for 2 decades. So the mayor got to, he can't talk out of 2 sides of his mouth. You either going to go with investing in the services and trying to have a community conversation without saying it's, New York City versus the shooters, because I don't think that that's the right narrative.
Are we going in the order of anger? Because boy, oh boy, do I have a lot to say too.
Yeah, I'm letting you go. Go ahead, Julie. Or you could give it to Carmen, and if you want to be the angriest, you could.
Yeah, you could be the angriest.
Carmen, you're welcome to go.
Yeah, I think, one thing that is important to understand is, if you ask somebody what safety looks like, it does not look like police officers in their community. It does not look like police officers knocking at their door. That is not what safety is. And if you think about these, the campaign that The Gathering has launched is Facts, Not Fear. It really is trying to disseminate information that is factual. It's not based on these fear tactics. But one of the things that I often think about is, the over-policing of our communities is at the cost of Black and Brown people. It's also at the cost of Muslim folks, right? We can't deny what happened in 9/11 to our Muslim siblings, and that didn't keep us safe, right? Over-incarceration has not made Manhattan, has not made Brooklyn, has not made the Bronx, has not made Queens or Staten Island any safer, right? Years of data and research have proven that incarcerating those charged with nonviolent crimes does not lead to safety, right? It leads to recidivism. And if you look at how much it costs to incarcerate somebody, it costs close to $300,000 to $400,000 per person. I think about Rikers, right? A lot of the people that we are incarcerating, or that we are, either you end up back in jail, you end up dead, or you end up in a prison, right? We're sending people to one of the most deadly jails in this country, right? I believe it's been 20 deaths since, I don't know when. We've had the 20th death at Rikers. And so for us to think that over-incarcerating, and if you look at the communities that are being over-incarcerated, it's Black and Latino people, right? And so we have to deal with creating strategies that address root causes to this behavior, such as mental health, drug and alcohol support, making us safer. There are so many people that are walking around thinking that they're going to be the next target because of what our mayor is saying. Bail reform, right? They use this fear tactic to get us to roll back bail reform. And like Linda said, there are so many people working for decades to get bail passed. But again, I think, I'm not the angriest because I'm trying to be the moderator, but I will say, I think about my husband. And one of the things about moving my family here to New York is that I feared he was going to get pulled over by police, because in California, when he would drive around, he would get pulled over for just driving my baby around to go to sleep. And here it's easier to get stopped, because you're not just getting stopped by police officers in cars. You're getting stopped by the police officer who's kicking it on the corner of the block, telling you to stop for no reason. So now that we're going to create this body of officers that are going to be with unmarked cars and with plain clothes, is not going to keep Manhattan. It's not going to keep New York City. It's not going to keep our state safe.
All right. Julie, gonna light it up?
No, I'll keep it low key. But I mean,
no, you have to keep it low key. Light it up.
I do think it's just really, really disappointing to hear all of this fear mongering and the talks about what public safety could look like being more police after all the reforms that have passed in the past 5 years. We've learned so much. And it's disappointing that we're at this place where this is what's being put on the table, is reinvigorating anti-crime units, which, Nick Smith gave you the list of names of who they've killed. There's more, it's a dangerous unit. And a report just came out, a 600-page report on the Baltimore Gun Trace Task Force, actually, that was disbanded because they were indicted on racketeering, conspiracy charges, robbery, extortion, fraud. And at the end of that report, I'm going to quote it because after they did this long investigation, what they found is an attitude that views the community writ large as an adversary rather than an ally and partner is dangerous and counterproductive. And so to hear that be the rhetoric that's being passed around New York right now is just really disappointing. More funding towards police, we know, is not going to prevent crime and is just going to cause more harm to Black and brown people and communities. Even the mayor has said we're going to focus our police on the 30 precincts with the most violence. But the way police analyze the communities with the most violence is where they've already been stationed and where they're finding crime. And the more presence they put in the same places they've always been just repeats this cycle. And so it just seems like we are not learning lessons, you know. The police were not actually defunded. And so if we have this problem with guns, it should, you know, logic tells us that more funding towards a solution that has not worked before is not going to continue to work. And we've learned a lot about facial recognition technology, you know, trying to bring that in when we know it's just a biased racist software is been banned in other places actually because of it. It's not going to be used in an unbiased way here just because we have more training or more protocols. Nothing in his plan included any more accountability measures or oversight. So, you know, my friend Victor Dempsey is still waiting 6 years for an administrative trial for an officer who shot his brother, Delron Smalls. 6 years, and there's still been no trial. Like, there has been no insight that there's going to be more accountability for any of these anti-crime units that we know are problematic, but it's just funneling more funding to them, saying we're going to train them better. And so we, like everyone said, we know that's not the solution. The funding has to go to communities, and we really just have to get the word out there to people that this isn't what public safety looks like. It's been tried and it does not work.
You all, and especially you, Linda, alluded to the politics is us versus them, which obviously never works. But you also mentioned the mayor and how savvy he can be. And so it's kind of a bipolarity. We know he wants to take us back, anyone who wants to address this. And yet at the same time, the video comes out, him calling, you know, the white cops the name. Some people believe, and I just heard this the other day, some people perceive him trying to appoint his brother head of his detail as a signal that the mayor himself doesn't trust the police. So those things don't go together. You want to bring more police.
Those are facts.
While you play this other political role, you don't trust police. You don't like the police. That's the message you're giving or pretending to give, and yet you want to drop all the police on us.
I mean, let's take it even farther back than that on some of the history of the mayor. I mean, if folks remember, there was a case called Floyd versus the city of New York. And it was a class action lawsuit against the New York Police Department around stop and frisk as a policy. And as you all know, at the time, Judge Schindler came out and said, you know, stop and frisk is unconstitutional. One of the people that testified on the side of the plaintiffs was Eric Adams, because he was a former police officer. So he came actually in support of the class action and the plaintiffs who were going up against the New York Police Department. You know, Eric Adams understands on a fundamental level. A lot of us know him for a long time. He is a former police officer. He's a state senator. He's a Black man from, obviously from Southeast Queens, but in Brooklyn for a really long time. And he understands these issues on a very deep level. And what's sad to me, Rev, is that it takes politics to make you reframe yourself in a way based on the political climate. So here comes Eric Adams running in this big race with like 14, sometimes it was 20 people. I don't even stop counting at one point. And he was able to be like, let me see what everybody else is at. Okay, here's where I'm going to be. So we have progressives and defund police, and we have people saying, maybe not defund the police, but maybe we could do some other things with the police. And I'm going to be the one that's going to go to Black grandmas and brown grandmas and white grandmas around the city and say, I know you're scared, and I'm going to be the hero. I'm going to make you safe, and I'm going to work with the police. And the bottom line is, Nick said this earlier, Rev, is that this is not just white people that are like, we need more police. I go to police precinct meetings sometimes, and I haven't been to many during COVID. But before that, I used to go to the one in my community. I used to go to one in Crown Heights where my dad owned a store out there. And you would walk into the police precinct meeting, and it would be the elders in our community sitting being like, I need to go to the store and be safe. you know, who's going to be on my street corner? I want another cop. So we have to also understand that this is a conversation that also has to happen internally within our community. And as Carmen said, did we ever ask our people, you know, what does safety look like to you? Because when you do ask some of our elders, they say safe for me is going to the grocery store knowing I ain't going to get shot on the way there. That's what they say. And we have to understand that and not everybody's activisty and not everybody's in the movement. And Eric Adams is brilliant. He knows that. He knows how to play on the vulnerabilities of voters and also the vulnerabilities of some of the leadership who are saying, look what's happening in Harlem. Look what's happening in, you know, New Bronx City. Look what's happening in, Canarsie or whatever. And so for me, I want the mayor to come out and say, listen, can you balance a conversation on public safety and also on civil liberties? Can you figure out a way where not only can we be safe in New York, can we also thrive and not just survive in New York, right? But also show us the money, bring the money back to the community. And why don't we test out, instead of the plainclothes units again, why don't you test out some mental health clinics in our community? Why don't you give some young people some jobs in our community? And also this big, conversation on guns. Mark, we know this in our communities, guns come from everywhere. And that cannot be the only focus for us to figure out where the guns are coming from, and try to find the guns. And I love those gun buyback programs, great. But that's not the whole foundation of the violence that's coming in our community. If we don't look at violence stemming from poverty, stemming from the type of desperation, stemming from mental health and other kind of factors, then we're not addressing the problem, and we're going to be in the situation for a really long time. And I know that Eric Adams knows better.
We got to go. Any of you, one of you can address bail reform and where that is?
Oh, I can touch on bail, but I do want to say one quick thing about the Democratic Party, my chosen party. One of the reasons why we fail is because we often lead from behind. So Linda, you're hitting the nail on the head. Instead of, when we go to those precinct council meetings and we hear folks saying, more cops, why aren't those who study this stuff for a living and write these laws saying, heard, but hold on, let's get to the root. Let's get to the root, which is prevention, which is the mental health systems, which is finally fixing our schools, as the key was getting at. That's the problem with the Democrats. When we get power, we want to hang on, but by leading from behind. And then bail reform, I'm going to tell you, that's another big problem, because we're hearing folks, the mayor just went up to Albany today to say, roll it back. And thank goodness the majority leader is like, hold on, slow down, because you want to add dangerousness, but dangerousness is in itself a form of element to lock up Black and brown folks who, should be at home. And so we've got to end that disinformation about bail reform causing spikes in crime. It's not true. The data does not show spikes in crime due to bail reform. The recidivism rate for those who are released on bail is less than, I think, 3 or 4%. Those are the facts in New York. So we gotta, reformers have to speak truth to power, lead from the front, and be loud.
Julie, did you raise?
I was just saying, it's 2% the rate, Nick. And right, it's so much misinformation about bail reform. And a lot of the headlines, they just keep blaming bail reform as being the cause when a violent crime happens, and it's almost never true. Same with bail reform had nothing to do with those 2 officers being shot. In 2017, they ended cash bail in New Jersey. Studies and data showed that there was way less people in jail, no increase in crime. They did the same thing in Philadelphia. Again, less people in jail, no increase in crime. Same thing in 2018 in Cook County. All of these studies show that ending cash bail has not increased crime, has reduced recidivism, removes people from jails. And so there's just so much misinformation. It's quick, it's political, it's quite a thing they can cite that, there's a problem with bail reform laws, but it's, the research shows that's definitely not the case. And adding dangerousness to the ability of giving judges that discretion is just discretion to pick who they want to end up in jail. I mean, there's already so much to their discretion. There's a lot of things I know that comes out that they can't even consider someone's prior criminal history. That's not true. They do consider it. And I guarantee they're considering dangerousness in some aspect. Encoding that into law just gives them the right to discriminate how they choose. When we really
Carmen,
can't let.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean because y'all, Julie, will you finish?
I'm finished.
2% is what she's saying. Queen Carmen, why don't you close us out? How do we go from a summer of reckoning and defund backwards to this?
I mean, look, we have to go back onto these streets. We need to get people engaged. We need to remind people of the facts, right? We need to counter the fear, information that is being disseminated. And we also want to go into the next segment because it ties into this segment, right? And so again, I think, I want to thank all of you for being on this panel. It was great to hear from you, Julie and Nick and Linda. You're going to be sticking around with us. And so the next segment connects to our previous conversation because there's an intersection between policing and public safety and criminal justice reform. So we wanted to invite two incredibly brilliant women who I happen to know quite well, and I've had the honor to work with and strategize with for so many years, and to talk about the critical areas of reform in our communities. Because the issue of policing and public safety is so linked to criminal justice reform, Linda is going to stay on with us, and we're going to bring in Donna Lieberman. Donna Lieberman has been the executive director of the New York Civil Liberties Union since December of 2001. Under her leadership, the NYCLU has expanded the scope and depth of its work, supplementing litigation with an aggressive legislative advocacy and field organizing program. As a result, the organization is widely recognized as the state's leading voice for freedom, justice, and equality, advocating for those whose rights and liberties have been denied. Donna began her public interest legal career as a criminal defense lawyer in the South Bronx office of the Legal Aid Society, and she's later acted as an executive director of the Association of Legal Aid Attorneys. For several years, she served on the faculty of Urban Legal Studies program at City College. And I think it was about in 2014, December of 2014, she helped us create at Justice League our 10 demands along with Vince Warren. So welcome, Donna, and welcome back, Linda. All right, is Donna with us? Yay, yep, Donna. All right. Well, welcome. We're so happy to have you and Linda on here with us. What reforms are still in the pipeline in New York State and New York City?
Well, there's a number of reforms that we're working on. Some of them are in the legislature, some of them are just through advocacy and need to be done at an administrative level. Like, it's ironic that we have a campaign going to end or disband the NYPD's Strategic Response Group. That's the special unit of police officers that the NYPD put together about maybe 5-6 years ago to respond to emergencies. Emergencies has become defined as Black Lives Matter demonstrations, among other things. And they are the ones who are responsible for the reign of terror against the Black Lives Matter protests and other free speech contexts, supposedly. And we warned the city about this group when they set it up. And lo and behold, they did exactly what we expected them to do. They're a hyped up, hyper aggressive group in the police department, and they go out there to make trouble. So we have a campaign to get rid of them. Of course, I'm not stupid. We're trying to disband the SRG at a time when our mayor is trying to revive the descendant of the anti-crime unit, which was discredited, which he participated with the NYCLU in city council hearings, with standing next to Yvette Walton in disguise because she was afraid to be retaliated against, a member of the street crimes unit, and talking about the racism and the abuses of that unit. So this may not be the moment in time when we win that campaign, but as a number of folks on this panel have already said, it's a time when we have to fight the campaign. You know, another initiative we have with the police department is like, isn't it time to get rid of the vice units? Isn't it time to get rid of the units that prey on LGBTQ people, particularly trans people of color? There's no excuse for them, but they're still out there. We have to get rid of this unit and stop with this institution that is designed to and has the effect of hurting people of color. And I want to say that, you know, unfortunately, and there's a lot to do on parole reform and other stuff, but I think that our job in the coming period is going to be to resist the attempts to roll back every single piece of the justice agenda that we have succeeded in getting through a very, very challenging state legislature. You know, it's, and the fact that our mayor has seized upon not just one, not just two, but virtually every reform that we have succeeded in achieving to level the scales of justice a little bit is really disappointing and I think telling, and our antenna, we should be on high alert. I am, Linda is. Linda, you on high alert?
Linda's always on high alert.
Yeah. So
always.
Well, some people say that about me too. So good, we're there. But it's about bail. It's about raise the age. They want to revert to the law that treats kids as adults and puts them in the adult system, even though all the data shows that if you treat kids as adults and you punish them as adults and you force them through the adult system, they are far more likely to reoffend and not get on their feet. And you know, when you treat kids as kids, it doesn't mean you ignore them. You don't just say, oh, you did something wrong, go about your business. There's a whole juvenile justice system. Sometimes justice belongs in quotes, often it does. But treating kids as kids who are developing and growing into adults is what the science requires. And why is our mayor pushing, pandering to the PBA? Who knows? Pushing to repeal the raise the age reforms. Evidence sharing. New York had the worst system in the country practically where for sharing of evidence. Many states have open discovery laws where the prosecutor had to share the evidence that they have against somebody, you know, well before trial, so you can prepare a defense. How do you prepare a defense if you don't know the evidence against you? Well, they want to do away or roll back that. And beyond that, solitary confinement. New York State has banned long-term solitary confinement. Why on earth is Mayor Adams proposing with the Corrections Officers Union, right, to reinstate solitary confinement like it was before? What we need in Rikers isn't solitary confinement. What we need is like programming, you know, things for people to do, ways for people to learn and grow and prepare for life on the outside. Not this like, you know, gang war that COBA has set up to destroy all sorts, everybody's life in there. I mean, and of course, closing Rikers Island. That package of stuff is really important. And you can't talk about what's important here without worrying about the kids who go to school. You know, this talk about the proposal, this promise, they're promising to put like another 1,500 school safety agents in the schools. Why? What for? We don't need them. We don't want them. You know, there was a school in New York City that had to close one day because there weren't enough school safety agents to man the metal detectors. I mean, you close because you don't have enough staff for the metal detectors? Did you ever think about getting rid of the metal detectors? I mean, and what I worry about with a new anti-crime unit is the revival of broken windows policing, all those things. I mean, I sat in a room with Eric Adams, 12 years ago to show him the stop and frisk data. He was so sympathetic. He was so concerned. I don't know what happened to his memory since he became mayor.
Do you think, so Donna, I kind of I want to get into some of this a little deeper. And so, I'm kind of thinking, I'm hearing you, and I'm hearing you sitting in a room with now, who is now called Mayor Adams. Like, is there amnesia? Right? Like, what happened? How can we hold him accountable? When I think about the SRG unit that was developed in 2015, it was developed in response to the protests that were happening after the non-indictment of Officer Daniel Pantaleo. And the protesters were actually, the two people that are on, here, Linda, myself, I think you were out there. I'm sure Mark was out there. And so it was in response to us, people who were actually organizers, people who actually had jobs, people who were actually wanting to stop this killing of police. So I think about that and how they put us in the same category as quote unquote terrorists, right? That's what they did to protesters. But then I also think about raise the age. To your point, we understand in the criminal justice system, cognitively, young people aren't able to develop their prefrontal lobes and logic and reasoning until the age of 25. And it's the reason why we've created a juvenile justice system, which New York State hasn't ever really used, right? To automatically prosecute a young person at the age of 16 is an injustice. It's a miscarriage to justice. But I want to say, the way in which he's looking at it is he's actually saying things like, if you don't snitch, right? If you don't tell on somebody, we're going to put you in the adults facility. And what he, Linda described him as charismatic. I've been in a room with him where he kind of like almost championed me to his cause because he hit the heart chord, when he was talking about the story of his brother and him being stopped by police and being, I think, beat by police, it kind of hit something in my heart. But then to hear that he himself is wanting for children to snitch, which we know what happens to children who tell on other children, and then put in an adult facility if they don't do that. The harm, it's consistent harm from the units he's trying to create, from the lack of accountability, right? So I want to bring Linda into this conversation because you've been part of all of this, Linda. And I sometimes feel like in the work that you've done throughout the years, you also have been a target. And so what are some of your thoughts to what Donna was saying? And what are some of the solutions that we really could share with the audience that they could walk away with?
I'll just say, just listening to Donna kind of go through all of the progress and all that's kind of still on the table, and then the contextualization of this political moment, knowing that we might not be able to go farther than we are. And in fact, we might be actually going backwards. I'm in a valley. I'm in a valley on a city level. I'm in the valley on the state level. And I'm really in a valley for our movements on a national level. I'm struggling with kind of seeing the promised land right now. I think that we're going up against the media. The media is the most powerful entity in the world. We could sit here all day and have these conversations, but the headlines are murder after murder after murder, and then interjected with police murders, and we're struggling to get to the hearts and minds of our own people. Because our own people are sometimes like, yeah, why was this guy out on bail? And then it turns out later on, he's the guy that shoots the police officer. And while there's no data to prove that people that come out on bail are increasing crime, they kind of choose these one case by case basis and try to frame the whole conversation. I think Eric Adams has to come back to a moment of, of reawakening, a reckoning, because we've all given examples of the many times he was on this side, and he was on the side of more equity and more justice in policing. And now when you become the mayor, same thing happened to Bill de Blasio. Bill de Blasio went in there talking about, I got a Black son, and stop and frisk was his entire platform. A lot of Black and brown people came out for Bill de Blasio because he said, stop and frisk, I'm going to end it. And then we found out that he was going to be one of our biggest challengers in the entire city when it comes to these policies and bringing back broken windows policing. And so I'm just in a space where we have to hold the mayor accountable. We have to remind him that we're also taxpayers, and I don't want my taxpayer money to go to things that I know don't actually help the issue that you're trying to address. Our fellow New Yorkers have to wake up and say, oh, show me the data that bringing back plainclothes policing units are what's going to make me safer. Prove to the people that the solutions you're bringing to the table actually work. And they have no data. All they have is a narrative that is neatly fit in to the fearful environment that people are living in right now. And that's not fair to people, to exploit their fear, their vulnerability, and the political climate just so that you could start bringing in more policing to our communities, and to roll back things that people have, busted their, what's for years. Like, it makes me sad to know the nights people have stayed up, the many hours that people have sat drafting legislation, lobbying, the many rallies, the many organizing, mobilizing one-on-ones. I mean, the resources that we have brought in as a movement to organize around police reform. And to be honest with you, like, I don't have a face to go around the country and organize other communities, which is what I do now, when I can't even get New York City straight. People are looking at me like, you over here trying to help me win an election over here. You just got a cop as your mayor. Like, what are you doing? And so, it is in my interest as an organizer to figure out how to interject this conversation, to get our movements kind of more coordinated and back together, and really to see if there's a conversation that could happen. And I will end by saying that even when we had a Bill de Blasio administration or an Eric Adams administration, or even, believe it or not, a Bloomberg administration, there's always people that may not necessarily, there are people basically who are our friends that work on the inside, who think that they're reformists and can go on the inside and maybe do some good for our community. We have to figure out how to bring those people, have those conversations, and see what we can do with this new administration. Like, we cannot write off Eric Adams for 4 years and just be like, he's just not going to be good for our people, we're just going to move on. There got to be a way to engage him, because our people's lives count on it, right? It's our communities count on figuring out how to do better and how not to go back on some of the promises we made to our community and the work in progress that we made for our community. So I'm like a little disappointed, but I'm also not going to give up. And I know that, Donna and the Civil Liberties Union are not going to give up. And they've been doing this work for a long time. And we have in the Gathering and others, but we're in a frustrating position. And I think the only solution from a movement perspective is we got to go back to our people and say, hey, here's what they're saying. I know it sounds nice and it sounds like it's going to make you safe, but let's talk and have a conversation about what really does make us safe. And I don't think we spend enough and invest enough time in doing that with our local communities.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Thank you so much, Linda. Donna?
Yeah, and I just want to build on that a little bit. I think it's really important for us as a movement to acknowledge that there are a lot of people in communities of color who are feeling really, really vulnerable right now. The data, there is an increase in violence, and maybe we shouldn't be surprised. We're emerging, hopefully, from like 2 years of pandemic. We talk about the trauma that people are going through and trying to get out of. It's not, it's real, the trauma, the continuing trauma of not feeling safe. But I think that it's important for us to try to, in many ways, it's important for us to shift the conversation to what is it that society needs to do to make people safe. And like, that starts, mental health. We have a society that for decades has its mental health program has been the streets and the subways and Rikers Island, right? We need mental health services at all levels for people who need a little bit of help, who in medium, and people who need long-term care. There are people who need long-term care, but it can't be what it used to be in those institutions where you go in, you never get out, and you never get any treatment. It has to be real care, medical care, attentive care. And so I think pressing for that is really important. I think also, we have Daniel's Law. It's a bill, not a law, that we're pressing for in Albany that would deal with mental health issues that are emergencies with, amazingly, mental health professionals instead of cops. For decades, we moved towards cops as the answer to all of society's problems, because that's where the political will was, to fund cops and cops and more cops. We need doctors and nurses and social workers to be trained and able and have the authority to respond as the first responders to people in crisis for mental health reasons. And the mayor says he doesn't support that. The NYCLU does. And we need people to help. We need for people to understand that when cops are the first responders, no matter how trained they are, in Rochester, they had a great training program for cops, and they responded with cop responses, which was violence that was fatal. They don't respond like nurses and social workers and psychologists. And so we need to get that message out there. We need to build support for Daniel's Law. If not this year, then next. And I have one more thing I want to say. I have a lot more I want to say, but just give me, we talk about accountability. One of the perhaps most disturbing things about that Mayor Adams has done was to fire the chief investigator at Rikers Island for refusing to dismiss 2,000 cases of misconduct against corrections officers. I don't care what his relationship is politically with the Correction Officers Union. There is no excuse for that. What we know historically, time and time again, that when law enforcement is not accountable, right, they're corrupt and they violate people's rights. And whoever is in the corrections union, they need to be held accountable. There are lots of good people in the corrections union, and there are some corrupt people and people who have violated rights. There is no excuse for firing the chief investigator for refusing to dismiss the cases of misconduct. And there are openings in all of the major accountability institutions that we fought for, Linda, you and me and Jumani and Brad, and Carmen, that we fought for, the Inspector General, the CCRB, right? They need to appoint people who are independent, committed to impartiality, and who will call it like they see it, not the way the PBA tells them to.
Thank you. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Carmen. Go ahead. Oh, a question I hate to ask, but I feel like I have to, because again, we had the reckoning, we had the defund movement. It was momentum, and just like the voting rights bill, George Floyd policing, not a lot was done. Amir Locke gets killed. What, last week, was it? And it's like we still are under the control of the mainstream media. If they don't blow a case like that up, it's as if we can't. And I fear, in the same way that sometimes some of us become numb to everyday gun violence, which is real, we know that. Folks have become numb to school shootings. I'm afraid, you all, talk me out of being afraid that we may be becoming numb to police violence. It just doesn't stop. It keeps happening. So it's like Amir Locke almost feels, we're not even talking about it anymore. It's not even being discussed anymore on social media. It's just matter of fact. Oh, this is just what it is. Talk me out of that feeling that I have. We're getting numb and anesthetized.
I mean, I'll start, Rev. I mean, I don't know if I can talk you out of it because I can't talk myself out of it. And I think a lot of communities can't talk themselves out of it because it's not just about police violence. People are watching police violence. They're watching gun violence. They're watching a lack of affordable housing. They're watching record high, you know, and at least hopefully now we're going to be in an equilibrium, but there were times of high numbers of COVID deaths in Black and brown and poor communities. And there's been so much loss around people, jobs, you know, financial losses, and also watching, you know, what's happening with voting rights, which you all are going to talk about in the next segment. I mean, we're losing on every front. We got no criminal justice reform. We got no immigration reform on a federal level. The Justice and Policing Act on the federal level wasn't even close to being radical. You know, the one thing that it would have done, Mark, which really makes me so sad, it would have banned no-knock warrants on the federal level, right? And those are the kind of laws that actually, believe it or not, save lives. Like Amir Locke was murdered in a no-knock warrant. Breonna Taylor was murdered in a no-knock warrant. And there's many of these cases that have happened across the country. Children have been murdered in no-knock warrants when there have been raids on the homes of their parents for potential drugs or whatever the hell the cops come looking for. And so I want people, you know, I can't talk people out of it right now. I feel like, again, we're in a valley, but our people are worth it. That's why we keep fighting. That's why we keep getting up. And, you know, we have to understand that, especially in an electoral conversation that we will be having in 2022. I keep telling people all the time, forget the federal races, forget who the president of the United States is. Who's your district attorney? Who's your county attorney? Who's your attorney general? I mean, we watched in Minnesota what it looks like when you elect a Black progressive on criminal justice and someone who has a position on police violence. And we saw what happened to the police officer that murdered George Floyd. Now, we don't know what happens in his appeal, but just watching the first part of that is important. And same thing, you know, when you elect a bad attorney general in Kentucky, like Daniel Cameron, who happens to also be Black. And so I think that I want to tell people, like, you know, if you're tired of national politics, let's focus local. Let's work on our district attorneys. Let's work on our attorney generals, and at least work the criminal justice system through that venue as one tool to the work that we're doing. But it's listen, I validate people's feelings. It's bad out here. And I think people are just like, when is this going to change? And it's been going on for too long.
Well, I think that we are about out of time, but this has not been time unfruitful. You two are great. Donna, I haven't seen you in a long time. It's great to see you. We got to meet each other back out here on the barricades again. We got to get past this. You're right, it is a lot of loss. It's tough. We got to get past this pandemic so we can get back out in these streets and wake folk up. And Linda's right, y'all. Police are governed locally. We really can't win a national social media police accountability movement. We got to struggle locally and hit those city councils and those mayors and, you know, fight for civilian oversight of police. We forget about that. Some of us, you know, we didn't want to do it. We chat, you know, again, folk fought 50 years of reverse row, 50 years. We don't get civilian oversight when we tried in 1 year and then we quit. No. So we got it. You're right. This got to be local struggle. Thank you both. It's a great conversation.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Great to see you.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Linda. As many of you know, Mark has been on the front lines of some of the most important recent and not so recent voting rights fights in our nation's history. So for this last segment on voting rights, Mark is going to join the panel of experts and I'm going to lead on questions. First up, I'm excited to welcome Justice League NYC member and our dear brother, Stanley Fritz. Stanley is the Political and Campaigns Director for Citizen Action of New York and the Public Policy Education Fund. Most recently, Stanley helped lead Citizens Action, Invest in Our New York, and Free New York legislative campaigns. He is the co-founder and creator of Let's Not Be Trash. Y'all need to check it out. It's a social media platform dedicated to discussing and unpacking gender, sexuality, patriarchy through literature, education, and conversation. Stanley brings together a strong background in both communications and community organizing, as well as a commitment to confronting and breaking down systemic and interpersonal injustice based on race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual preference. Please help me welcome faith leader and organizer, Reverend Stephen A. Green. Reverend Green is a global thought leader at the intersection of faith and social justice. As an activist and pastor, Reverend Green leads with radical love, thank you for that, and action through his ministry at the Luke NYC St. Luke AME Church, and as the chair of Faith for Black Lives, a faith-based social justice organization. And he's been out in them streets. I see you. I see you. And last but not certainly, I am pleased to introduce a sister in the movement, Stephanie Valencia, who is the co-founder and president of Eki's Lab. She is a national leader at the nexus of politics, technology, and leadership development. Stephanie recently served as a political director at Investing in Us, a political venture capital fund focused on disruptive platforms and initiatives to enhance civic participation, and earlier ran strategic partnerships and outreach at Google. She served President Barack Obama in senior roles throughout his presidential campaign and both of his terms. In addition to mentoring many young Latinos and Latinas, she is the co-founder of the Latino Talent Initiative, the Latina Collective, and Latinos 44. Stephanie also serves on the board of Civic Nation Center for Community Change and the Latino Victory Project. I also want to say she is my fellow co-founder of Poderistas. Welcome, everybody. All right, so let's get into it. Stephen and Mark, discuss recent faith leaders' hunger strike and the legacy of civil disobedience and voting rights. I know that you all were really involved in that. And so tell us more about that.
Stephen, you want to start?
All right, sure, I'll go. Thank you, Carmen, for allowing me to join this August body in this really incredible state of emergency town hall, people's town hall, as we know the people have the power. And that is really what motivated a cadre of faith leaders from across the nation. We began with 25 on the anniversary of the insurrection on January 6th, on a hunger strike all the way to King Day and beyond, because we believe that this moment requires deep level of sacrifice. We have on the pendulum of nonviolent direct actions, we know that letter writing, petitioning, and picketing are on the list, as well as street blockages and civil disobedience in different areas. But on the other end of that spectrum is a hunger strike, a severe bodily sacrifice, a high risk, but it also moves towards a high reward, recognizing the importance of raising the nation's consciousness, lifting the moral argument by suggesting, as our dear brother Joe Madison did, as students from Arizona also joined us, but recognizing how important it is that we were willing to die, because our democracy has died. Our democracy is dead. Our democracy is on life support. And we were willing to make that ultimate sacrifice in regards to the state of our nation, because we recognize how severe it is, how detrimental it is for people in Arizona and Alabama to be packed into one congressional district. And so that is what really led us into this hunger strike, and glad that it mobilized faith leaders from across faith traditions and really allies across the country to be engaged in the struggle and keep it going as now we move towards the next iteration of our fight.
I would just add briefly, this is a big fight, and a couple of things. I want to applaud Stephen for calling for the hunger strike. In solidarity with Joe Madison, we should acknowledge what Joe did, putting his health at great risk. Again, the apathy that's out here, anything that any one of us can do, you just don't know how it can inspire others. And at the end of the day, we were out of moves in terms of what was happening in the Senate. And so as people of faith, and I think to some extent we all are, whatever our faith is, Christian, Muslim, whatever it is, sometimes that's all you got to count on, because the things you want to happen are still hoped for and unseen. And so faith is all you've got left. And so now that has led, and I mean, it trickles up. So that has led to folks on the ground in Arizona saying, now we don't want you to bring your Super Bowl to Arizona in 2023 because of what the senator did and because of Arizona's own egregious voter suppression laws. This was a call that was made by the people of Arizona and 400 faith leaders from around the world, around the country, before the Brian Flores lawsuit. And that's not an unreasonable ask. There's precedent for that because the NFL moved the Super Bowl out of Arizona in the 90s over Arizona's refusal to acknowledge Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So these are the types of things that we have to continue to organize and push back around. And that is local. That's Arizona. There are 19 states where folk probably need to think about doing local and state actions. And so this is the fight we're in, and we got to stay in it.
You know, when I was listening to you both speak, you know, I thought about Dr. King, Reverend Dr. King's quote, or principle number 4. He's got 6 principles of nonviolence. One of them is accept suffering without retaliation for the sake of a cause to achieve a goal, right? And that's what you do. You know, when I was listening to you, Stephen, what it really entails, it's exactly what you said. Self-chosen suffering is redemptive and helps the movement grow in a spiritual as well as a humanitarian dimension. The moral authority of voluntary suffering for a goal communicates the concern to one's own friends and community as well as to the opponent. The hunger strike, right, is able to communicate. And what's fascinating is a lot of what I see you all doing resonates so much with me as a student of history under the feet and teachings of Mr. Harry Belafonte, who was a confidant to Dr. King. And so using those same tactics is so important for people to understand and connect to the movement in a very different way outside of social media. But I want to talk about, you know, the current state of various state bills limiting rights, and also Monday's decision in Alabama. So I'll let you all, I could see your Reverend Mark's head shaking, but.
Yeah, I think that, you know, what we're seeing is an entire onslaught, which is an onslaught of our democracy, an onslaught of violence towards the very fabric of the institution that was never fully available for all of us to inhibit anyway. But the progress that we made was better than what we once had. And now there's an intent to bring us back to a dark and desolate place where Black people are not valued as full citizens. And I think when we talk about these challenges to democracy, it's about the idea of citizenship, that Black people in America are not deemed equal citizens under the law by the white, normative, patriarchal, supremacist class. And what we're seeing take place in 34 states across this country, or 19 states, 34 bills across this country, is this intention to erase Black political power so that white folks can continue to hold on to their claim of the American idea, the American dogma, the American narrative, because they see that the nation is browning, that Black and brown folks will become the majority in this nation. And so they are losing their minds, trying to figure out what will it look like for them to live in a nation where they are not the majority. And so they're doing everything to erase our power. That's what we saw in Alabama. And I was articulating to folks today that the Alabama case sets a precedent for the entire Congressional Black Caucus to be erased, because Supreme Court decisions create precedents. And so now if you're saying that there's no need for a second Black district in Alabama, 10 years from now, when you're doing redistricting, you can say there's no need for one Black district in Alabama, right? And you can move folks around. That's what they were trying to do in Texas, what they were trying to do, what they will try to do in Florida. And so we're talking about erasing Black political power to a point where we go back to when Adam Clayton Powell was elected to Congress right here from Harlem in 1944, where there was one Black seat, one Black person in Congress. And this is post-Reconstruction, post the World War II. So we're talking about losing the very fabric of having Black participation in this democracy on a national and federal level. And it's already happening on state legislatures across this country. And so we're seeing that the reality is that the United States of America is this sort of democratic republic. There are 50 kingdoms that are tied together to create a loosely created government. And so each state king, is, AKA a governor, is doing all they can to fight back against this narrative of the nation becoming browner, of the nation becoming more diverse. And so what I'm arguing that these states are doing, they're essentially seceding from the Union. Like, this is just what's happening. This is the Civil War, and the states are essentially a cold civil war, because no one wants to say it's a civil war, but no one wants to say it's a cold war because it's actually really happening. But it's a cold civil war-like movement that's taking place, and states are intending to secede from the Union because they're afraid of becoming a diverse and multiracial social democracy.
Woo, preach. I felt that. Reverend Mark.
Oh, you sound. I'll love to hear from the other panelists. I agree with everything that Stephen has said, but like I've been saying, most of this broadcast, our enemies never stopped. I think the mistake we've made historically is getting victories, seemingly things that are victories, and then exhaling. Mm-hmm. This is Black History Month. Let's explode the myth that the white man gave us the shortest month of the year. That's not true. Carter G. This was a self-determined month. Carter G. Woodson picked this month to coincide with Frederick Douglass's birthday. So it's not true that we didn't choose this month. This was a month chosen by our people for us, but a month where we would highlight our history. Carter G. Woodson said we should still celebrate it 365 days of the year, the other 11 months. What Frederick Douglass said, his birthday coming up on February 14th. So when you show love, show some love to the ancestor, please, folks, is the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. And I don't think we really know what that means. What is eternal? That means we fight, and our children fight, and our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, our great-great-great-grandchildren. Our ancestors who were enslaved fought for freedom, and they were never free. They were born enslaved on the plantations, and they died enslaved on the plantations, but they never gave up and still fought for freedom, still tried to find ways to escape, find ways to, even if they had to, poison master and mistress. These are the things we have to be about in terms of that eternal vigilance. We may not see it in our lifetime. Just like, as I said, I go back to the people been fighting Roe for 50 years. Some of those folk are dead, but they never gave up. And so now they're on the precipice of literally taking away women's rights to govern their own bodies because they've been fighting it for 50 years. So here's the problem, and I'll try to be as brief as I can. We like instant gratification. We are all Instagram now. Gotta happen right now.
And Instagram, YouTube, TikTok.
Gotta happen right now. It's instant. It's instant. And then when it doesn't happen instantaneously, we can't deal with it. And so, yes, people were asked to vote in 2020 and vote in a historic fashion in Georgia in 2021. Everything has not happened that we thought should happen. There was not a real majority we voted for. And so some of us have said, man, y'all lie, this ain't no majority. Biden ain't done nothing. Democrats ain't done nothing. I'm not voting. But the sad part about it is our enemies are still fighting, voting, pushing, making change. Malcolm Kenyatta, the brother in Pennsylvania, says it best. Folks who don't do politics and don't stay in politics and understanding to keep voting need to understand that even if you don't do politics, politics does you.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great segue into bringing in Stephanie Valencia. Reverend Green talked about the browning of this country, right? This country becoming more diverse and people fearing that. And it's the reason why they make an effort to stop us from voting. Stephanie, I learned so much from you through Poderistas, learning about the confidence gap within the Latino community, also the concerted efforts at disinformation that is being targeted at Latinos communities. Could you tell us more about that and how do we actually build trust?
I want to pick up on something that Reverend Green said, just about the different approaches that our enemies are using to try to stop and tamper our participation. And one way that that is happening with Latinos is through language access. Somehow we have made speaking Spanish political. We have made speaking Spanish a crime, or not choosing it as a primary language as a crime. In fact, part of why the census is so critically important and why so many people were pushing so hard to make sure that citizenship question did not make it onto the census was because the census helps to not only distribute resources across this country, government resources across this country, it also helps to ensure that people who do not speak English first or as a primary language have an ability for coverage, for assistance in voting, in elections and in voting around Spanish language or other non-English languages. So again, going to the Browning of America and the diversification of America, in this last census, almost 100 new communities were added to the list that are required now to provide Spanish language or other language access to Latino and Spanish dominant voters. And so that is something that many times in many states and localities have been tried to kind of chip away to exclude people from the process, to make people feel like they do not belong in this country, that they do not belong in participating, they do not have a voice, whether they are a citizen or not. You know, looking back to, you know, states like Arizona in the early 1900s, passing literacy tests so that the ignorant Mexican voter could not participate. And these are other backdoor ways to try to inhibit participation among Spanish dominant and Latino voters. As Carmen mentioned, you know, Latinos are driving growth of the population and driving growth of the electorate in this country right now. And the sad fact of the matter is that only 50% of eligible Latino voters participated in the 2020 election, which means 50% of Latino voters who could have voted chose not to. They stayed on the sidelines. And so the question really is, why is that the case? You know, African-American voters turn out at 64, 65%, white voters over 70%. And while participation is not power, it is a pathway to power. It is a way to show up and say, hey, we are here, we matter, our voice matters. And until Latinos feel like they belong in this country, it is hard to see how we will increase our ability to vote. One of the things we've talked a lot about at ECIS is something that is called the guest complex. And whether you're first generation Latino, you immigrated here, or whether you are 13th generation and your family's been here for many generations, chances are you still feel like a guest in this country. And if you feel like a guest in this country, you're not going to feel like you can sit down without permission, let alone move the furniture. And so if you don't feel like you belong in this country, chances are if this country is telling you you don't belong, you're an outsider, you can't speak the language that you spoke growing up, the chances are you're not going to feel like you can fully participate in civic society. And so how do we change that mindset among Latinos? And that's a lot of the work that we are doing through Poderistas with Carmen and through other means. But really, the right and others are trying to kind of exploit that notion of not belonging to continue to make us feel like outsiders. And we're seeing things around, you know, the election, around disinformation, which I know we'll talk about at different points or a different point in this panel, but, you know, how disinformation is being used to reinforce that notion of not belonging, how disinformation is being used to create wedges between Black and Brown communities, and how that is continuing to keep many Latino voters on the sidelines and treating them like they don't belong.
I think, Stephanie, you hit something that is constant in my life. You know, I constantly talk about, on my father's side, my father didn't cross the border crossed him and his family. And his family being deported, and many people being deported who had become citizens after this land was taken from Mexico and deported under the Repatriation Act of 1930. And so when you say that you know, we feel like guests, it's because we are guests, right? We're consistently told that we are not American. There's a Mexican in front of the American, right? There's not just American. There's a consistent threat when it comes to the border of Mexico, when it comes to our people. Trump used a lot of that type of racist rhetoric when he was implying that Mexicans were rapists and killers. And so I could see how there could be a confidence gap as somebody who is I think we're like 8th, 9th, 10th generation on my father's side from this country, yet have never felt as though we were from here. And we are land people without no land, right? Especially Mexican Americans who are not good enough for the Mexicano and are called pochos. And so we are othered there, and we're not good enough for the American because we don't have the blonde hair and the blue eyes. And so I could see how that is. And you brought something up that I think we could all chime in on, is how do you hold platforms accountable that use this type of disinformation to divide Black and Brown communities?
Yeah, it's a huge problem. I think there are, the disinformation that is being used to divide Black and Brown communities. Then there is all the disinformation that is coming, that is kind of going back and forth between the US and Latin America. The Spanish language disinformation challenge is really one that is a hemispheric challenge. It's an entire Western hemisphere challenge. It is information coming from Colombia and Mexico and El Salvador, and is being exchanged on platforms like WhatsApp that are completely and totally unregulated by the platforms. And so there is a complete asymmetry, as we've seen in many recent documents, you know, from Frances Haugen's testimony, around how the platforms are not treating Spanish language or non-English languages and regulating disinformation in the same way as they are in English. We have spotted stuff that continues to exist online in Spanish that is basically a carbon copy of something in English, but continues to live on in Spanish because the platforms haven't taken it down. So there is a lot of work to do to, you know, hold the platforms accountable on their response to disinformation, both in the context of what's happening in the US, but throughout the entire hemisphere as well.
Do others want to chime in around the disinformation that divide Black? You know, one of the things I've been to the South, and one of the things that we hear, and we heard this back in the day with the depression, right, was that they're taking our jobs. And so, you know, that's also the disinformation that happens to divide our communities. And so, you know, if other folks want to chime in, would love to hear your thoughts on this, and then we'll move over to Stanley too.
Yeah, just plus one to everything that Stephanie said, but just really zeroing in on the Republican Party, which has really been pushing an anti-immigration agenda and trying to make like folks coming from Mexico, folks from Southern America, and folks from the Caribbean kind of the linchpin of their issue, when really that philosophy comes from this idea that by the year 2045, white people will no longer be the majority in the United States, and white people are not having enough children. And they're afraid of what the world will look like when that happens, and what the world would look like if they're in the majority. So then they're creating these narratives to criminalize and punish folks who come from different countries. And we also have to remember, when we're talking about the way that like this country and the Republican Party specifically talks about immigration, the United States is a country that destabilizes multiple governments. They destabilize Honduras, they destabilize Venezuela, they destabilize multiple countries, and they cause the issues that these countries are facing, right? So then now these folks have to leave their country to find safety, and then America criminalizes them and tries to disrespect them and say that they are coming here illegally. When the fact of the matter is, when you support conservative governments, when you help to assassinate leaders, when you help to push policies that are going to destroy communities, when you fight to stop wage increases for people like they did in Haiti back in 2010, because H&M didn't want to pay more than 50 cents an hour, so they stopped the minimum wage increase, you depress communities and you force people to find other options. And that's what's happening here. So if we're going to actually talk about immigration, and we're going to talk about the way that like this country has been racist towards undocumented people, whether through voting, whether through like access to services, we got to talk about the complicity the United States government has in destabilizing these countries.
And a lot of times when I'm in debates a lot about people who come to this country, and defending that as folks that are coming as economic refugees, right? And so we have to really name it as what it really is, right? And I don't think we actually say that. People are saying other things, and again, it's the othering that allows us to do away with the whole community. I've seen it every time I've traveled somewhere. But Stanley, since you're on the topic, I want to bring it back to the local level, right? Let's talk about ranked choice voting and how that worked out here in New York City.
Yeah, no, definitely, Carmen. Thank you so much. But before I talk about ranked choice voting, I want to shout out the New York City Council for passing a bill that makes it legal for undocumented people to vote in local elections. That's a very big deal. Undocumented people contribute to New York City, like through the workforce, through the cultural contributions, but also in tax dollars. So just because undocumented folks don't necessarily, quote unquote, pay traditional taxes, they pay a bunch of subsidiary taxes. So when you buy things, the sales tax. When you're paying rent, you're paying other bills, they contribute billions of dollars in revenue to the state of New York. So they should have a right to say who gets elected into office. And I know there was some pushback from some elected officials who said this would dilute the Black vote. That's ignorant, because undocumented people are not just from Mexico or South America, 1. 2, there are Black people in Mexico and South America. 3, there are Black undocumented people. So it's disrespectful to try to just say that this dilutes the Black vote. We should be in unity with all folks, but particularly our sisters and brothers all across the diaspora, the Latinx diaspora. So now ranked choice voting. We started ranked choice voting in the year 2021. And I really got to say, ranked choice voting works really well if you use it effectively. And what it pretty much does is gives you the option to rank your candidates from best to worst, or your top 5 or so candidates. If we would have had this in our national election, when folks had to choose between Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, who was mayor for 5 minutes and decided that he could run for president afterwards, you would have seen a lot different results in who ended up winning those primaries, because folks didn't have an option to say, maybe Bernie Sanders is my number 1 choice, but Elizabeth Warren is the second best thing. And then then every other candidate, so on and so forth. And we could be having vote counts that actually reflect where people are on the issues. We don't have that privilege. So instead, what happened was, when Bernie Sanders seemed to be getting a bunch of support, Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, and a couple of other Democrats pretty much worked together to undermine his candidacy, and Biden became the nominee. And then you had Biden versus the white supremacist. And what are you going to pick? Not the white supremacist. In New York City, we created a ranked choice voting process so that we could actually have more equity in our voting. Unfortunately, the city did not fund the education of ranked choice voting enough, so people didn't actually know how to use it properly. And I think the fact that we got a Black cop who is mayor is proof of that, because if folks actually better understood how to use ranked choice voting, we probably would have ended up with Maya Wiley as the mayor of New York City, with respect to Eric Adams and the work that he's done here. Now, ranked choice voting is just one leg under the rung of good government. Politics is a contact sport. And if you actually want to be effective in politics, particularly local politics, and make a difference, you have to be able to have a say in the game and a say in who's getting elected. And one of the biggest ways that folks impact policy is through their votes and through their dollars. Right now, there are elected officials who are getting thousands of dollars from big corporations, real estate, policing, housing, all sorts of organizations with special interests. And when they get elected, these groups are then going to these elected officials and saying, don't support good cause eviction because it'll stop people from getting evicted and it makes it harder for us to gentrify neighborhoods. Then they're going to Eric Adams and they're saying, we want you to invest a whole bunch of money into all these new technologies for police. It's not going to reduce crime. It's not going to make anybody safer, but we have a stake in this. It'll make us money. So then they're doing it. That's why New York State 2 years ago passed campaign finance reform. So what that means is, say Carmen decides to run for president and I will volunteer for her campaign in 5 seconds if that happens, right? And she goes to this community and says, guys, I'm running for office. Can you contribute to my campaign? Every dollar that we give her, the state will match by another $6. So for example, let's say I give her $10, the state will match that another $6. So now her $10 turns to $70. So now Carmen is running for office with community dollars. Those are the people she has to be accountable to. She's not thinking about ExxonMobil. She's not looking at the real estate industry. She's not looking at the NYPD or the Corrections Association or the District Attorney Association, whose entire existence is to put poor people into prisons. She's looking at Ms. Johnson at 365 Thafford Avenue in Riverdale Towers, who said we need more green spaces. She's looking at Zakiyah, who lives in Far Rockaway, and says it's a transit desert. I can't get to work because only the A train runs here and it doesn't run consistently. She's looking at Nick, who's in Harlem, and he's saying, yo, the highway is right next to my neighborhood and a lot of people have asthma. We need to do something about that. And that's the component of good government that we need. The more democratic the election process is, the more access that regular people like me, you, and everyone on this call right now and folks outside have to run for office, the better off we'll be. Jermani Williams, a public advocate, he ran for city council with publicly financed dollars. He ran for public advocate with publicly financed dollars. So when we had this, we get more Black and brown people in office, we get more undocumented people in office, and we expand the power to vote.
So who's running for office here? Let's get behind them. Let's get behind them. Okay, Reverend Green. Okay, you know we all volunteering. Well, thank you all so much. I'm gonna pass it over. I really want to take the time to thank you all for this dynamic conversation, this dynamic. I think it's important for people to understand. Stephanie said something, there's power in the vote, right? There's access to power with voting. And sometimes we don't see it, but we do feel it. And so thank you all again. I'm going to pass it over to my co-moderator, Mark. Can
you hear me?
Sorry, I think I paused.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry. Stanley started talking about the government infiltrating CIA infiltrating other governments. Knocked my computer, my internet off. Listen, y'all. True story. Just true story. Years ago, I had a guest when I was doing AM radio in DC who written a book about Richard Nixon bringing the drugs, heroin in from the Vietnam War in body bags. Had a whole book about it and knocked the whole radio station off the air. So that reminded me, when we had him on there, the whole radio station went down, the tower broke, everything. So when Stanley did that, it reminded me of that. He started dropping those bombs. But Carmen, it is a pleasure. It is a pleasure being with you. You all follow Carmen on her social media. She's always organizing, doing important work. And if nothing else, see her beautiful family. I think Baby Justice, when Baby Justice was a little baby, I think I was the first one to get him to do we got a picture that he did the Black Power fist.
He did.
Right there. As soon as he saw me, he said he did just like that. And everybody's like, whoa, where you get that from? So love to you and to the family and to Jay. Good to talk to all the panelists. Great conversation. Thank you to Jules Hoffenberg.
Yes.
Who is behind the scenes and not behind the scenes, but she does great work, and we appreciate her as well. And I hope people will learn from this conversation as well. Just one of the things that I think Stephanie touched on, I just want to just amplify. The division that exists, again, goes back to their social media, y'all. The algorithms on social media promote division, promote controversy. So as many people watching us tonight, this will go viral if Carmen and I got in a fight, because the algorithm picks that up and drives that out for more impressions. And I see a lot of young people who really, suicide is a problem in our community. I'm talking to young people who are suicidal because they don't feel like they get enough likes on their social media, and that affects their self-esteem. So we can't tie other people's algorithms and their businesses to our self-esteem. Our self-esteem is tied to our ability to be a self-determining people. That is us making our decisions for our communities, ourselves, without any external interference from any external forces, and being eternally vigilant in that regard. So again, I want to thank you all for having me here. Great panelists, great discussion. I'm fired up. And we look forward to doing more together. Love you all. Jules, are we okay? I had to jump on my phone, so I can't see the format or the agenda no more. I know I'm probably off script, but Jules, just tell me, come on and give us some instruction, because I don't know.
We so thank you to Zakiyah, Julie, Stanley, Reverend Stephen Green, Donna, Linda, Nick, and Stephanie. And thank you, Reverend Mark Thompson, for joining me and helping me lead this conversation with a sense of history and legacy and intention. I hope we can do it again soon. I think we make a good couple. Our next virtual event is going to be really, 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 really special on Tuesday, February 22nd at 6:30. I need you all to tune back in. The Gathering for Justice will present our Gatekeepers of Truth series, featuring a conversation between our friend and board member, Ebro Darden, and our elder, the great Danny Glover. You don't want to miss it. To those of you watching at home, and if you liked what you heard tonight, please follow us at NY Justice League and at Gather #4 Justice on Twitter and Instagram. Keep up to date with our work. You can text us, as well as finally, you can support our work by making a donation. One of the things that we do is we also fund ourselves. There are a lot of organizations that have been funded through the pandemic. And one thing that I'm going to ask for you to make a donation. The work is important. We have to continue. We don't always get the dollars because of the conversations that we have are too forward thinking or quote unquote radical, but we need you to make donations. And so please, on Cash App at $Gathering for Justice, or by texting us The Gathering to 44321, or visit our website at gatheringforjustice.org. Thank you, everybody, and have a safe evening. And thank you for tuning in. Good night.